So the case study I wanted to talk to you about in a bit more depth is a sepsis simulation model. So when we were starting to think about using simulation in patient safety, we wanted to develop a simulation which tackled a key patient safety issue and one that we could really help to improve. So we chose sepsis. As you know, I'm sure, sepsis is an inflammatory response to an infection, and it's progressive. So you start with the infection, you go on to sepsis, you go on to severe sepsis and septic shock. And it affects, in the UK, 100,000 people a year, and there's a very high mortality rate, about 35%, and it is completely preventable. So it is, that's an unacceptably high mortality rate, I think, and especially if you know that you could have done something about it. So what we wanted to do was to simulate this probability of infection using a disease progression model, progressing to sepsis from a hospital admission, test it with a hospital and then test it with further hospitals, so that we could work out how you could localise this. Because we thought if we were going to go to the effort of getting a correct disease model which shows how sepsis develops, then we needed to be, we should be able to get it to a number of different people who could use that same model and just localise it with some key parameters rather than having to reinvent the wheel. And what people would want to do is to test the impact of the improvement strategies. So here's our sepsis model, and I'll just flick over to the actual model rather than the screenshot. So we haven't put a very pretty front end on it as yet, but we will be doing that. But what you can see is we've got this disease progression model, which powers a discrete simulation model. So what that means is, whilst you're in a particular state, then you are likely to receive a particular set of services, have a particular length of stay. So these services on the right-hand side, the length of stay in the bed, are dictated by the state that you're in, and the state that you're in is dictated by your likelihood of moving from state to state if there's no intervention. So I'm just going to run this through so you can see on screen that what's happening is people are coming into those states. We've got all admissions coming in. A number of those are discharged. There's a small proportion that are likely to have an infection, and then another proportion likely to have sepsis. And of course you can move from state to state. The sepsis patients have a probability of dying or moving on to severe sepsis or getting better and just going back to being a normal admission, and so on until everybody's discharged. And at the bottom you can see the numbers developing here. So what we were wanting to do was to test this with the data that we had and make sure, I've just run one run here, that the results we were getting were as expected against the data. So the simulation was replicating a reasonable replication of the number of infections from the total number of admissions and how they progress through to sepsis deaths. So I hope that makes sense as the sort of overview of the model. And of course we know that the improvement interventions are that the more frequent and effective observations you do, and the earlier intervention you're able to put in place, then the better chance of cure. And of course there's an impact on patient outcomes and their length of stay. So we used a number of different assumptions. We used healthcare activity, but we also used assumptions from desk research, and you can see the progression rates and some of our sources here. So we know from admissions data that 2.5% of patients are likely to be infected, and then you can see how they progress through those different states there, and also then the likelihood of mortality once you're in each of those states. And the important thing for the model is that the patient will progress through each of those states in sequence. And then as you transition from admission to infection, there's that 2.5%, but that 2.5% is consistent for every day that a patient stays in hospital. So we're using that formula. So what we're doing is recording the number of days that a patient has spent in each state, and then each day the patient spends increases the progression. The patient is in the hospital, you read that data off the spreadsheet. So we're essentially putting all of those assumptions in a spreadsheet, which is accessed by the model. So each patient's assigned a length of stay based on an average distribution. So if you're in an infection state, then your likely length of stay is 3.7 days, to septic shock, which is around 20 days. And you can see that we've drawn on different research evidence, because not every hospital has this kind of data. But of course you could look for it, but this was a fairly straightforward way for us to look at what the likely length of stay would be, and this can be changed in the model. And the patient recovers once they've spent the requisite amount of time in that particular state. So every day you have that risk of progression, so from sepsis to severe sepsis to septic shock, and again that risk of mortality each day that the patient is in one of those states. And so this is the kind of data that we need to create a baseline for any hospital. So the scenarios we tested were: what happens if we increase the number of patients who receive treatment? What happens if we increase the number of patients who treated within 1 hour and also within 3 hours? We looked at septic shock and severe sepsis independently and together, and we looked at the impact on mortality. So again, using research assumptions, you can see that, well, we knew from the assumptions of this particularly useful study that 30% of patients are unlikely to receive effective treatment. So we created a probability distribution based on that research, which shows that kind of survival and the likelihood of people the onset of sepsis from that. And here's our results. So if you increase the number of patients who are receiving treatment, so 30%, so what we're looking at is that 30% who are not effectively treated, who have septic shock over 36 hours. The graph is showing you that you can move from that 35% mortality base to around 33%. And if you bring that forward to 3 hours, so treating those patients within 3 hours, you can bring that mortality rate down to 29.65%, so you're reducing by 5%, and again by 6% if you treat within 1 hour. And so we looked at further results where what happens if you treat 50% of people with septic shock and severe sepsis either progressively or at the last minute, and what happens if you treat 100% with severe sepsis and septic shocks progressively at the last minute, and what happens if you treat everyone with both those conditions within an hour. And again, we have these results here, so you can start to see the impact of your interventions on mortality depending on how many people you're able to treat and how quickly. So you could bring that down really quite significantly as a result. So our future development in this model, we're happy that the disease model is measuring the disease as it progresses and then the impact of change. But the next part of that work is to measure the bed days that people are using. So we've also got some results around that. Also look at other factors and develop our user interface. And we're interested in talking to anybody who'd like to collaborate on this with us. We've already presented it to some key patient safety groups. It's been very well received. We want to test it with other groups to see whether this resonates with them as well, because obviously being able to make an impact on sepsis is really key, and if we can help to do that with simulation, we'd be absolutely delighted. So that's really where I want to end. I hope that's been a helpful insight or ideas if you haven't been thinking about this, about using simulation in patient safety. And we believe that we can help improve patient safety just by testing those intervention and impacts before you implement them, providing a better evidence base for change which might help expedite better decision making, and sharing those best practice messages and helping stakeholders to understand what the impact of change might be and engaging them in that process. So before I sign off, I just wanted to ask if there are any questions that have occurred to you over the webinar. And I've had a couple where people have typed them in whilst we've been speaking. So I'll just read those out and think of the answers. So one question we've had is, other than sepsis, what other areas would you like to see simulated around patient safety? That's a really interesting question. I mean, if I think about that sepsis model, the way that it's built, the way that it's conceived, which is you're in a particular state and you're deteriorating unless an intervention is implemented, fits with a number of other conditions. So I'm thinking of pressure ulcers, for example, behaves in a similar kind of way, perhaps pain management. So any sort of deterioration where an intervention might stop that deterioration would be a suitable kind of question to use that sort of sepsis model, but you may well have other ideas, and please do post those up using LinkedIn, perhaps later if you don't want to now. Right, another question is, the sepsis model had research data in it. Would it be possible to use my data in this, and how easy would that be? Oh, that's a good question. Well, we built it really with that purpose in mind, and we use research data really to try and get as correct a model as we possibly could, knowing that probably progression rates for sepsis are not something that most hospitals would collect. So we thought if we got the underlying logic of the model right, then it should be reasonably easy to put local data in. So if I go back to, if I had a slide up about the sort of data that you need, there we go. So you, for this, as a sort of baseline for that model, you'd need to know your number of patients that are admitted, number of patients with sepsis and different forms of sepsis if you got it, and certainly the number of patients who died. And with that, you could start to get some useful results, which you'd then probably refine. And, oh yeah, another question, how long does it take to build the model? So we had obviously we had to do quite a lot of research to start with. So the model actually didn't take that long to build. So probably in elapsed time it was about a week, but we kept going back to it and refining it because more data would become available, or with our research we'd find out something new and then we test it. So as a project it's probably taken us 2 or 3 months, and we think that, you know, if we go out to a hospital with it tomorrow, somebody would give us some more insights that would mean that you'd probably build something else in. But to get that to the level that it currently is, and also with a lot of interaction with some of the stakeholders we've been working with, probably build 5 months, but of the project and the toing and froing, sorry, 5 days, building a couple of months. But then obviously with a simulation, that's part of the benefit of it. If you build the simulation, then what you want to do is to develop your understanding as a result of seeing what the simulation is telling you, and that's a benefit in itself. People are learning from that. So that's not sort of time elapsed before you get any value from it. Value was being derived from this model, I think, all along. Any other questions that people might want to ask? No? Well, thank you very much indeed for joining the webinar. Again, I hope it was useful. We'll be posting up some of these questions, and if you want to ask subsequent questions, please post them through and we'll answer them, and we'll post some of them up on our LinkedIn site, Simulating Health, and we'll be sending you through details of that in case you're not already joined up to it. And look forward to continuing the discussion. If you're interested in any of these models, if you're particularly interested in the sepsis model, do please give us a call and talk to us if you're interested in testing it out or you've got ideas for how we might improve it. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Our next webinar will be in November, so we do these monthly. And we are going to be at the Healthcare Design Conference in November, where we've got a very exciting product that we're launching specifically for healthcare design. So our webinar next time will be focusing on the spatial environment and using simulation for design. So very different question, but still highly relevant, and hope that some of you will be able to join us then. Thank you very much.